Okay, so in the vegetation section of the form, questions 6 through 12, items 6 through 12, there's sort of a progression. There are two of them that are changed in the order this time. It makes sense to first talk about which plants you have and then to talk about whether they're recruiting, reproducing. And so it used to be that question 6 was about whether it's reproducing and question 7 was about which ones you have. Now it's reversed. But so the questions are, first, which ones do you have? Do you have the right ones? And then, are they reproducing? Then the question is, what story are they telling us about soil moisture? And are the plants that we have the ones that form communities that can hold stream banks together? Are they vigorous enough to do so and to reproduce and so forth? And then, do we have enough of them to actually stabilize the banks? And then finally, in those places where we need it, do we have the communities that provide the wood that the channel may need? Some channels need wood to function properly and others don't. But that's the progression down through there. So a little bit more about vegetation. We've talked earlier about succession, and that starts with pioneering species that are the first to establish. They come in on freshly deposited soil. Some species, such as cottonwoods and willows, are particularly well adapted to come in on freshly deposited soil. The hairs of the cottonwood, cottony seed catch on that wet stone or the wet sand, and that causes the cotton to stick there, and then it begins to send a radical down into the moisture. And so they're just really well adapted for that. Other plants are much better adapted at coming in where we've got finer soils, more organic matter, more nutrients, a more stable environment. And so anyway, we have the colonizers. They often come into shallow open water or to barren areas, and they have root systems that could be either a stoloniferous or a rhizomatous plant. A stolon is a horizontal stem that's above ground. Rhizome is a horizontal stem below ground. The shallow and weakly rooted root systems of colonizers is sort of famous. And then young plants of stabilizing species may also be in this pioneering or colonizing phase of plant succession. If it is the stabilizing species, then once they get established well enough, then they can begin to stabilize the system. Even the others, the colonizing species, begin to stabilize the system, but they're still sort of vulnerable until we have enough of the stabilizing species with enough root system and strength that they can really hold things together. So they're critical to the initial recovery of some systems, but over the long run, without the roots that we really need for the stabilizers, they're just not dependable. A good example of that is brook grass. You can see it sort of growing out into the water here. You often find the rhizomes and the leaves of this almost floating on the water, and so it's a pretty recognizable plant. There's a couple of species that do that. Few-flowered spike rush is another common early seral pioneering species. Not a real strong root system, but you know, it gets the process started. They stick into the flow a bit, they collect some fine sediments, they provide a growing medium, and from that growing medium we can begin to attract some stabilizers and provide a place for them to grow. The ones with the really strong root systems tend to grow in the really wet zones, which has always been sort of surprising to me. Why do we have strong roots? Aren't roots for getting water? Why do we have them growing in the wet zones? Well, it turns out that they grow there, and I think probably they're actually evolved to be able to hold the system together, to hold the water there that they need for their survival. There's a discussion of that in an article by Korenblit, and I've been sort of intrigued with that concept for a long time. They have the strong root systems, the cord-like rhizomes. They also have deep fibrous root masses, and they provide the protection against the water's energy. coarse leaves and strong crowns. Willows and sedges are particularly good at withstanding the flood forces and letting the water bend them over but not tearing them out because their root systems are so strong. This is Nebraska sedge. One of my first grad students, Mary Manning, studied the root length density of 4 community types, and the one that had the strongest, highest root length density root system was Nebraska sedge, over a mile of roots and rhizomes in a 4-inch cube of the topsoil of Nebraska sedge. And when another student took soil cores of Nebraska sedge sod, cut them in half and put that cut edge against the wall of a flume and let the water run past, they just did not erode away. Other plant communities with fewer roots did erode, but not that one. Here's some other examples. Baltic rush has strong rhizomes, and it was number 2 in her study. Clustered field sedge, hardstem bulrush, and again Nebraska sedge up close. Those are good herbaceous stabilizers. And then we also have a couple of grasses, foul manna grass, blue joint reed grass. They do a good job. Most grasses, though, are not going to be effective stabilizers. So if what you've got is grass right up to the edge of the channel, chances are not real good that you're going to have the stabilizers that you need. The sedges and rushes do a much better job. The amount of stability offered by various species is one of the bits of data that you can get about the plants that you identify through multiple indicator monitoring. The website that supports that, RMS MIM, if you Google that, you'll be able to download the software for evaluating the MIM data, and that software has in it the stability rating of about 400 plants that have been observed in multiple indicator monitoring. So you can find out what that stability rating is. Alma Windward's riparian vegetation monitoring book rates the stability of various community types which have dominant plants, and that's a good way of getting information about it too. Of course, we also have woody plants, and the woody plants are generally good at stabilizing, but the ones that are pictured here are particularly good. Yellow willow has a really strong, it's a tall clumped willow. Most all of the tall clumped willows are good stabilizers. They're going to be more effective than, say, coyote willow or sandbar willow. In Nevada, we have developed a form, excuse me, with the most common and most important riparian plants. On that form, we have the wetland indicator class, the successional rating, early, mid, or late, and the stability rating of the various species. And that form is a particularly useful tool for people doing riparian assessment. They can use that as a checklist to identify the plants that they find them on, as well as the position of where they find that plant, to help them with this question of what is the story that those plants are telling. Do we have the right species? Do we have them in the right places? And those questions will be important, as you'll see, as we move through the various items in the PFC assessment. So question 6, there is adequate diversity of stabilizing riparian vegetation for recovery and maintenance. So we're really focusing on the stabilizing plants, those that have the root systems that are able to hold the stream banks, that are able to hold the channel form. And so what we need to do, first of all, if we're going to manage a system, we need to know whether we've got the right ingredients present, so that if they had a chance, they could reproduce and grow and prosper. Are they even there first? Do we need to replant them because they're not there, or do we have them present? And so this is not a question of do we have enough of them, except it is a question of do we have enough species present, because presumably if you have just one species, it could get wiped out by some sort of a disease or insect pest or something, and you'd like to have something on the bench to be able to back it up if needed. So generally, we're looking for a couple of species, and probably in each of the functional groups of plants that you need for that stabilizing job. It might be herbaceous, might be woody, but you're looking for a couple of species. Now, an exception to that would be a place where you have a potential to grow only one species of riparian plant. Obviously, though, the white top here is not that situation. That's a weed that's taken over to the monoculture. Where we have the dark and the yellow, that's a couple of species at least, and that's a yes, whereas the white top is a no. So the purpose is to determine if there's a sufficient number of stabilizing plant species present. Not whether all of the stabilizing species are there, but are there at least a few enough present to be able to do the job of stability. For most riparian areas, 2 or more for each life form, but it depends a bit on the potential of the reach. Some reaches have the potential for only one woody or only one herbaceous plant, and so then 1 would be enough. We're not asking about all the plants common to an area, but more than 2 are required in most cases. It's a presence-absence question, not an amount question. Upland plants do not count. It addresses the entire riparian area, not just the stream banks, because we're wondering if they're present in the area to be able to become abundant at some point in the future with this question. Caution at the green line, it is not uncommon for the water's edge to be comprised of only 1 species. So again, it's related to the potential. So determine if the reach needs herbaceous and woody vegetation. If so, then you're looking for a couple of species of each. Item 7, there are adequate age classes of stabilizing riparian vegetation for recovery and maintenance. So this is really telling us about whether the plants that are there are able to reproduce under the present management. And of course, the age classes is most easy to see with woody vegetation. These cottonwoods on the lower Truckee that we talked about earlier were not reproducing for a very long time because the water management was not right. In some situations, our grazing management is not right to allow the willows to escape, and they stay, the seedlings stay nipped off down close to the ground, so we don't have those older age classes and the higher plants. And we're really looking for a diversity. It's the old plants often that provide the work, but it's the young plants replacing the old plants that allows that work to go on through time. So where we have that diversity, it's a yes. Where we don't, it's a no, obviously. So it requires at least young and replacement or middle-aged plants. Because we're focused on the reproduction, we could maybe not have the old ones, although that question will come up in other questions, whether we have the actual physical ability of the older plants to do the work. In this one, where we're talking about reproduction, we're looking for the young and the replacement, the middle-aged plants. Seedling or germination plants or mature plants do not necessarily indicate that recruitment. And it's the recruitment that we're looking for. You may need to address your woody plants and your herbaceous plants differently. So this is one place on the form where you could have both a yes and a no. But if you do, you would have a yes for one group of plants and a no for the other group of plants, and you make sure that that is addressed in your notes. So a couple of examples here. Oh, I guess we're on to the next question. So item 8, species present indicate the presence of riparian soil moisture characteristics, and that's for the maintenance and recovery. Indicate the maintenance of the riparian soil moisture characteristics. So on this channel on the left where we have bluegrass, which is probably a facultative plant, is not indicating the level of wetness that the soils in that situation indicate that system was formed under. It was formed more with the sedges and rushes. On the right, we find the sedges and rushes in the riparian area down inside the incision. Now, the soils up on the top of the bank there tell us that it used to be wet up there, but because we have the sedges and rushes where we're doing the recruitment for the maintenance of the present riparian zone, we would say no for the left and no for the top of the bank, but really the answer on the right is yes, because down in the riparian zone that's relevant today, the answer is yes. But you describe that in the notes. Make sure you capture the story in the notes. The purpose of item 8 is to determine if the water level is being maintained or raised, as indicated by the plants and where they grow, the presence of those riparian wetland indicator plants. Maintenance of existing water table or restoration of a former one is vital to the functioning of a riparian system because, largely because, it's the water-loving plants that have the root systems that are needed to be the stabilizers. And so we have to have the water maintained, and certainly the change in hydrology is an important part of the story in many watersheds. Some instructions. It's position sensitive because riparian areas are defined as this transition between the aquatic and the upland. The flow regime will dictate the kind and extent of riparian wetland plants need to understand, therefore, the site potential. It's difficult on intermittent streams to know just how wet it could be. A lot of intermittent streams have the potential to become perennial. Some don't. Some of them have the potential to flow long enough to have some species, but not others. And so it's a bit of a challenge on those streams. Indicator plants are labeled by their wetland indicator status, obligate, facultative, wetland, and in some cases facultative must only be present. It's not the amount question that we're asking here. It's the question of in the right places. Where are they in order for a yes answer to be given? Item 9 is talking about whether the plants are grouped together in plant communities that are capable of withstanding the moderate high streamflow events, and if that plant community is present on the streambank. We may have plant communities that are stabilizing away from the streambank. This one really demands that they be on the streambank because it's right there on the edge of the flowing water where the rubber meets the road, where the velocity of flowing water meets the soil or the roots, and we need the roots there to do the work. On the left, you see cottonwood roots, woody roots, and next to whitewater. So they're doing the job even though they're next to very high velocity water. On the right, we see this area that was adjacent to a beaver dam that blew out, and that wetland soil allowed the plant community that has extremely high root density and extremely high bank stability, and so that answer would be a yes in both cases. Here we've got a no in both cases. On the upper left, we have a stream that just doesn't have much in the way of vegetation yet, not much stabilizers, and on the so we have some species around, but they haven't really formed themselves into communities really anywhere along that stream bank where they can hold the bank together. On the right, we have a community of vegetation, but if you look closely at it, you see that it's spike rush. It's Eleochorus, so it's not a stabilizing plant yet, and so that would be a no as well. It's on the stream bank, and it's beginning to do the job, but it's not stabilizing species, so that would be a no. Because it really does need to be on the stream bank. So what is the stream bank? You know, sometimes I've heard people say throughout my career that the stream banks are bare and eroding, and what they're really talking about is some sort of a terrace wall, some sort of a gully bank that's above where the bank full flow is against the bottom part of that bank. That's the stream bank. That's the place on the bank where these stabilizing plant communities need to live. We wouldn't expect the stabilizing plant community to be up here on the gully bank or the terrace wall, the step. We would expect them eventually to be able to grow down next to the active channel where the water and the capillary fringe allows them to grow. So roots are tremendously important, and what we find is that some of these wetland plants have just tremendous root systems. So the amount of below-ground biomass is huge in compared to the above-ground biomass, and those are the ones that are often the stabilizers that do the best job. Alma Windward spent decades of his life walking streams and developed this stability graphic here from his 2000 publication on riparian monitoring. And you notice that the anchored rock, the red bar, is a 10. It's obviously, but the willow sedge community is also a 10. It's got such tremendous stabilizing effect that it can do as well as the anchored rock. Baltic rush is very good. Beak sedge is very good. They're also stabilizing plant communities. The willow bluegrass is coming reasonably close, but the bluegrass is not particularly good. Bluegrass by itself is much less good, and of course, fairground isn't getting the job done. Coyote willow is about halfway up the scale, about a 5. Not enough to be a stabilizer by itself unless it's mixed in with the sedges to help it out. Question 10 is the vigor question. Healthy plants reproduce more effectively. They're more competitive in community dynamics. They have greater root biomass and depth to protect against erosive forces, so vigor is good. On the left, you see some plant communities that broke off the edge of the terrace and fell down where their roots could get water from the stream, and those are vigorous. But up on the terrace, their neighbors, used to be neighbors, are not vigorous because they're dehydrated. Dehydration is certainly a problem for plants. Over on the right, we have plants that are getting the water they need and getting the opportunity to grow, and they're doing quite well. And of course, part of the reason we're interested in vigor is because of this below-ground phenomenon. How you treat the above-ground part of a plant definitely has an impact on what's going on below ground, and the plants, herbaceous plants, all plants, have to have leaf area in order to be able to photosynthesize, in order to have the carbohydrates to grow the roots, and then the roots can provide the nutrients to provide the leaves. That's how the whole plant works. All plants can handle some grazing, but all plants can be severely injured or killed by grazing that is too severe. Of course, grazing has been a big issue in riparian areas. You certainly could not determine the vigor of a plant by looking at how much it was grazed just recently, but collective overgrazing through time can definitely reduce the vigor of a plant, and there are usually indicators on a plant that will tell you about that. For instance, the width of a sedge leaf is a particularly useful one. A Nebraska sedge leaf that's as wide as your thumb is very vigorous, and one that's narrow, say the width of a pencil, is not very vigorous. So herbaceous vigor affects the productivity, the root depth. It can be observed with chlorosis, sort of yellowing of a leaf sometimes. Sometimes that's because of inappropriate nutrient availability or pH. It's going to also affect the proportion of reproductive versus vegetative shoots. If it's very vigorous, it's going to have more reproductive shoots, and of course reproduction is part of that recruitment that we talked about back in question 7. For woody plants, you can look at the leader length. A vigorous plant is going to have longer leaders, vigorous amount of leaf area, It's not going to have the chlorosis or the yellowing of leaves, except, you know, in the fall. You certainly have to adjust for that. Branch morphology can tell you about vigor. The height-age relationships. You can also look for physical damage, breakage, insect damage, and various things. So maybe not measurable, but observable, and so it's in the checklist. On to item 11. Now we're finally talking about whether we've got enough of the amount, an adequate amount of stabilizing riparian vegetation to protect the banks and dissipate the energy during the moderately high flows, the 5, 10, 15, 25-year flows. Maybe not the 100-year events, although some streams can do so, but basically all streams, if they're functioning properly, if they have the right form and vegetation to provide the functions, can withstand those 25-year or less frequent storms. But they need the adequate amount of stabilizing vegetation to do so. So here's where we evaluate that. We have stabilizing species in both of these photos. On one we've got enough, on the other we don't have enough. So obviously that's a yes and a no, and they're on the bank. The purpose is to evaluate the adequacy of that vegetation, the lineal distribution of stabilizing plant communities along the bank. So when I'm doing PFC assessment in the field, I'll often pace off a distance of the stream bank to see how many of my steps in the old sort of windward green line evaluation process. He used a pace along that curving green line, and based on the proportion of the plant communities that are stabilizers or not, I use that to make my call, also thinking about the needs of that particular stream. And those plant communities are there with their root systems to hold the banks together, but also, of course, plant communities right on the bank of a channel can dissipate stream energy, both with the roots but also with the tops during flood flow. And it's during the floods that the banks particularly need that stability. So it's an estimate based on experience. There's a little bit of research about how much is enough, but the tech guide doesn't tell you that because it's going to vary a lot from stream to stream. That's where the knowledge of the interdisciplinary team comes to play, and their time in place in the local area is going to be quite helpful for that. The indicators, it's the amount of stabilizing riparian plant communities on the stream banks. Most perennial stream banks require at least 70% cover of stabilizing plant communities or embedded rock or anchored wood on that green line, on that first line of perennial vegetation adjacent to the water, but up out of the water. Some streams may need 80% or more, depending upon the size and composition of the soil materials, and those plant communities, the stabilizing ones, need to be on the bank. Many low-gradient sinuous streams require as much as 90% stabilizing plant communities. The good news is they have the ability to grow that proportion of stabilizing plant communities. At least they do right up until the time that the water level is lowered, so that those stabilizing plant communities can no longer grow there. The ID team needs to look at the presence of indicators such as stream bank failure, slump box. Do they have a high width-depth ratio on the channel? The bank instability along a straight reach between meanders is one way to see whether you've got what you need. Some stream bank instability, erosion on the outside of a meander bends is normal, but do you maintain the channel dimension, pattern, and profile? In other words, is your point bar keeping up with the erosion on the outside of the bend? That's an important thing to look at. If it's not keeping up, then probably your straightening and the sinuosity is related to the lane balance because it's related to the gradient and slope, and so all things are connected. So here's a quiz. that we often give in class. So we have a chance, if you were rating this, would you say yes or no, because you do or do not have an adequate amount of stabilizing riparian vegetation on the green line on the stream banks. We've got some cottonwood trees growing here, so that's probably some woody roots under there. That's probably good. Unfortunately, we don't have a very high stem density for slowing the water of a flood, and that water is likely to be pretty fast. We may not have enough roots in the herbaceous community. That looks like a lot of bluegrass to me, although I wasn't there to take the photo. I can appreciate that somebody took a before and after photo from the big waters of the early 80s. Now, was this a 25-year event, or was this a 100-year event, or a couple of 100-year events? Maybe it was more of a flood event than this system could have withstood anyway, but certainly it did not withstand the flood events it did get, and it didn't have the woody plant community, the willowy plant community that is normal for this gradient of channel and is part of the potential of this site. And so the water flowed too fast, and it picked up the bottom and the banks of the channel and moved it with it. And then once it did, of course, then the weakened channel, the non-functional channel, was able to erode very quickly thereafter, and we had a very different system within not too many years. Item 12 is about the plant communities and the wood that they can provide. So plant communities are an adequate source of woody material for maintenance and recovery. We used to be pretty focused on coarse or large wood, and there were diameter ranges provided for that. A lot of the research for that came out of forested systems, a lot of it in the coast ranges over on Washington, Oregon, and California. And yet when you get to Great Basin and smaller streams where we don't have the potential to grow large, coarse wood, we still find that wood is important in a lot of channels. The live source is the question here. Do we have the plant communities that can provide that source, that continuing source of downed woody material? It's necessary as a hydrologic modifier in a lot of places, and yet the size varies by the stream size, by the flow regime, by the ecological setting, so it doesn't have to be real large, but if you need it, you need wood. Here's an example of woody material, and it's, in this case, it's the roots below, the woody roots below, as well as the branches and the limbs of the stems of the woody plants that are doing such a wonderful job of providing stability and energy dissipation and roughness elements and so forth for this channel. So that one's a yes. And then we're on to geomorphology. So I'm going to pass the baton to John. Any questions about vegetation?